Okay, welcome to another video. Hopefully the audio is a little bit less noisy than it was in the last video that I recorded. If not, let me know. I'm trying to change my OBS settings and I'm adjusting the noise suppression and the noise reduction stuff, so let me know if it sounds better or worse than the last video. Anyway, in this particular video, what we're going to be doing is something similar to what I did in the last video that I uploaded, which is essentially mixing drums as well as like with the melody. So like not just mixing drums on their own, but with the melody involved as well. And I'm going to be going over how to make the drums just smack really, really hard, as well as being clear and audible and all that fun stuff. So here is the beat that we're working with, and I already have everything mixed, so I'm going to go through and turn everything off and then turn them on as we go, and we'll, hopefully learn a thing or two as we go. So here's what it sounds like completely done. Okay, so I have all my melodies here, obviously, and then all my drums are down here in pattern 1. So I've already got everything, like I said, everything is pretty much done mixed. So let's start going over what I did to mix these and how to make the drums hit really hard with the melody. So the very first thing I do is I obviously put everything on the mixer channel here. So I've got I've got two different 808s and I've got them going to the same place. And this is what's on the mixer channel for that. I've got an EQ. And one of the things that I don't always do, but I did in this particular one, was I actually carved out space for the 808 and the kick respectively in each other. That way when the kick hits and the 808 hits at the same time, they're clear and you can kind of hear them both a little bit better, which is why I've got a dip here at 154 hertz in the 808. I'm also boosting the low end a little bit, but the reason why I'm dipping the 808 at 154 hertz a little bit is because the fundamental for the kick was at about 154. In this case, I've got it at 159, but it was kind of in that region. And I did something similar in the kick. So you'll see in the kick at 44 hertz, I'm kind of ducking that a little bit and then boosting the 150-ish range. And like I said, the reason for that is I'm trying to make room for the kick and the 808 together so that they aren't clashing and the same frequencies aren't fighting with each other as much. So let's isolate the 808 and the kick. Something else I'm doing with the 808 and the kick is I am sidechaining. So let's go ahead and turn off the effects for the 808 and the kick. And this is what they sound like just on their own. Okay, when I turn on the effects, I'm not only turning on the EQ that I just mentioned, but I'm also turning on a wave shaper for the 808 and the kick. And I think on both of them, you can see on this one I'm soft clipping, and on this one I'm hard clipping, but it's very similar what I'm doing. So the EQ is causing them to get out of each other's way. The hard clipping and soft clipping is just to help push the volume up, make it a little bit louder, a little bit more present. And then I'm also sidechaining. So you can see that the kick is sidechaining to the 808. So if we go over to the limiter, we can see that the very beginning of that 808 is being ducked down as the kick is coming in. So here's before the effects. Here's after. So the kick is obviously hitting harder, it sounds like, because I'm pushing it into the hard clipper and adding a little bit of saturation as well. But also, like I said, I've got them ducked out of each other's way so that they can kind of hit and impact together and kind of swell out as that 808 fills out the space a little bit. Something else to note is I've got both the 808s. This one isn't in mono here, but it already is in mono. In fact, I can make this completely mono just to make sure. The kick and the 808 are both in mono. You'll notice that with my main snare, it's mostly in mono as well. And then my main hat, I actually forgot to do this, should also be mostly in mono. I think it already was mostly in mono, so that probably didn't do too much. Alright, so that is the kick in the 808. With the main snares, I've got two different snares being layered together. One is this one, and the other is this one. Okay, you'll notice that on this one, I've got it separated a little bit. And I've also got a spreader, which is doing something similar. It's kind of pushing things out in the stereo field. And then I'm also adding some reverb to this particular layer as well. So together they sound like this. You'll notice that with the reverb, I've got it mixed almost entirely out. It's at 23% mix level. And that's because, well, one, I don't want too much reverb to begin with, but also later, as we'll see, I've got all my drums going to one place, and those are being compressed and clipped off as well, which is going to bring up the level of that reverb. If you don't have the reverb mixed down enough, later on when you start compressing things, it's going to bring that reverb up. So you really don't want too much reverb at this point, because like I said, I'm going to be compressing things later, and it's going to bring that up. I don't always do this, but on this particular main hat, I've got a little bit of Fruity Blood Overdrive, which is adding some saturation or distortion to it, and then a Wave Shaper, which is soft clipping, and then also adding some more saturation and distortion. Here's what it sounded before these effects. And here's after. So just making it a little bit brighter and a little bit more like present, a little bit more in your face. Something else you'll notice is I've got the EQ, I'm boosting up the highs a little bit and then cutting out pretty much all the low end. And I'm doing that for, or I should be doing that for all the other drum sounds as well. So let's do that. I think I misspoke, not the other drum sounds, but the other hat sounds. Because in pretty much all of my hat sounds, whether they be closed hats or open hats, I really don't want anything below 500, 600 hertz or so. I mean, there are some exceptions to that, but for the most part, that's going to be true. Okay, so the main hat has a little bit of saturation, some clipping going on. These two open hats, this one doesn't have anything going on, but I am separating it because it's not a main sound. All of my secondary sounds, whether they be open hats, secondary snares, secondary claps, secondary rims, whatever the case is, I tend to separate them. So on this secondary hat, I'm not adding anything additional, I'm just separating it. On this open hat, however, I'm adding a little bit of reverb, mixing some of it out, and then adding another spreader, which is pushing it out in the stereo field. And something else you can see is with all my non-main sounds, and you can probably hear it as well if you're wearing headphones, I tend to pan the non-main sounds left and right. So we can see that with this one, it's going left, and then the next time it'll go right, and it bounces back and forth. You can probably see and hear the same thing going on with these secondary hats that are like rolling from left to right and right to left. So I've got my 808, my kick, my main snare claps, and then all my hats, and all of those are being sent to my drum bus. Okay, so on the drums, what I've got going on is an EQ where I'm cutting the high highs and then kind of boosting a little bit of the mid-high range. Okay, and then I've got a Wave Shaper, which is hard clipping, and then adding a little bit of saturation at the top. Okay, I've got a compressor and limiter that are turned off, but then I've got a parallel compression patcher preset. The way that this preset works is I've got my dry signal at 100% here, and then I'm mixing in some wet signal. I'm also low cutting and high cutting, so we can see that. We look under the hood here. This is my low cut. That's where I'm cutting right here. And the reason I low cut here is because when I'm adding saturation and distortion to the parallel processed signal, it's also going to add low end to a lot of my stuff, like my hats especially, it's going to add low end. So if we hit play, we can actually see as the hats are playing, there is a bunch of information down here, even though we cut all that out earlier. And again, that's because I'm processing these sounds again by adding saturation and distortion. So I'm adding the low cut to kind of take out some of that low information. I'm also adding a high cut to make sure that the hats don't get too loud and too bright. So that's the drum sounds kind of on their own, and I've already kind of talked about this a little bit with the kick and the 808, but I've also sidechained some stuff. So like I said, the kick is being sidechained to the 808, as we saw here. And you can probably see something else is being sidechained here, and we'll talk about that now. So my main snare, I tend to sidechain to my 808 as well, and my thinking behind that is my snare tends not to hit right when the 808 is initially hitting on the impact. So if I take a little bit of that volume out of the 808 a little bit later in the tail, it's probably not going to be noticeable, but what it is going to do is at least my thinking is, it's going to make a little bit of extra room for that main snare clap, or whatever you're using, so that it can shine through a little bit more. And I've got it here on a fruity compressor, and I've got it on both of these, so they both have essentially the same settings. And if we look at the limiter here, we can see that's where it's being taken out right there. So when that main snare comes in, it just kind of ducks the volume of the 808 just a little bit. Not quite as much as the kick is doing, but it is, you can visually and hopefully hear it as it's ducking the volume down. Duck the 808 a little bit more when that kick comes in. Okay, let's talk about the melody now and how we mix the drums with the melody itself. So if we pull up the EQ for the melody, we're going to see a couple of things. Okay, so hopefully as we can see and hear, a couple of things are being ducked. We can see a band that's being ducked on the very low end, and that's when the 808 is coming in. So if we go over to the 808, we've got a peak controller here, which is controlling the lower frequencies here. So every time that 808 comes in, all these low frequencies get pulled down. And I'm also doing something similar with the main snare. So if we pull up the main snare peak controller, that's what's causing this like mid-high range to duck down in the melody. And it's just doing that when that main snare is coming in. And the reason why I chose this frequency range specifically is because that's where the main snare is mostly sitting. So I'm just carving a little bit of room out just when that snare comes in. So let's turn everything off. Oh, and as far as the melody is concerned, some of the other stuff I've got going on. Oh, I forgot to mention this. I'm also sidechaining the low end of the kick as well as the 808. So the low end of the melody is really getting squashed down every time a kick and an 808 come in. So on this, for the kick, anything below 113 hertz in this case is what's being ducked down. So we can see that here. Okay, so in the melody, the low end is getting ducked down by the 808 quite a bit, but it's a little bit lower in the frequency range. For the kick, it's also being lowered, but it's much like more quickly and much more instant, so it's not as noticeable over time. And then in the upper mid range, some of those frequencies are getting ducked by the main snare. Something else I'm doing is I'm using a limiter to just kind of boost the volume, and then just sometimes I'll limit off a little bit of the stuff that gets a little bit too loud. In this case, that's not really happening. Of course, I say that, and then you can see some limiting happening. But I'm also boosting the volume by about 3 decibels. Okay, so let's do a before and after. Let's turn off all the effects for everything. So here is with all of the effects turned off. I'm going to, on this one, I'm going to leave this on, but that way I've got my wave shaper there, but I'll turn everything off. That way I'm not clipping. So here's what everything sounds with all the effects turned off, including the melody, all the side chaining, everything. And then here is with everything turned on. And this will include the parallel compression, the EQing, and everything else that we've done, including side chaining. So here's after. So yeah, hopefully you enjoyed. Hopefully you learned a thing or two about mixing drums with the melody. If you have any questions, feel free to throw them down in the comments. Or if you have anything you want to see in the future, feel free to throw that in the comments as well. But yeah, that's about it. Let me know if you have any questions, comments, concerns, and let me know if you want to see anything similar to this in the future down in the comments. But yeah, that's going to be it. Hopefully you enjoyed. Have a good one.